Chapter 12. The story of Queen Tuthiana continues, a mystery of wing and madness. Mr. Qwerty took a sip of tea and continued. The child of Harum and Rashmi, for that was Tuthiana's mother's name, seemed to be a normal mortal child. As there were no other human children living in Punjab High Low, her parents thought it best to raise her among other mortals, and so they settled on the outskirts of a small village at the edge of the jungle. The young girl was well loved and protected and lived a simply happy life until she was 12 and lost her last baby tooth. That's when all her troubles began, until she was 12 and lost her last baby tooth. You're late. Troubles? Catherine asked nervously. Yes, troubles, Mr. Qwerty said. For when she lost her last baby tooth, Tuthiana sprouted wings. By the end of this first miraculous day, she could fly with the speed of a bird, darting to the top of the tallest trees to choose the ripest mangoes, papayas, and starfruit for the children of the village. She played with the birds and made friends with the wind. But while the children delighted in Tuthiana's new skill, the adults of the village were bewildered, even frightened, by this half bird, half girl. Some thought she was an evil spirit and should be killed. Others saw ways to use her as either a freak to be caged and paraded about, or to force her to fly to the palace of the new Maharaja and steal his jewels. Harum and Rashmi knew that to keep their daughter safe, they would have to pack their few belongings and escape. And so they did, deep into the jungle. The village children, all of whom adored Tuthiana, tried to persuade their parents to leave her alone, but it was no use. The grown-ups of the village had gone mad with fear and greed. They built a large cage, hired the best hunters in the land, and asked them to capture the young girl. Among these was a hunter most mysterious. He spoke not a word and was shrouded from head to foot in tattered cloth stitched together with jungle vines. The villagers were wary of him, and even the other hunters found him peculiar. He knows the jungle better than any of us. It's as if he's more a creature than a man, they remarked quietly among themselves. But Harum and Rashmi were as wily as any hunter. Harum, knowing everything there was to know about tracking, could disguise their trail so that no one could follow it, and Rashmi, who could converse with any animal, enlisted their aid in confounding the hunters. Tigers, elephants, even giant pythons would intercept the hunters whenever they neared. But the hunters, eager for the riches and fame they'd received if they caged Tuthiana, would not give up. Why can grown-ups be so strange and wicked sometimes? Catherine wondered, not asking aloud so as not to stop Mr. Qwerty's story. He cleared his throat and continued. The children of the village were also determined to thwart the hunters. They defied their parents, sending word to Tuthiana and her mother and father again and again whenever the hunters were stalking the jungle. Tuthiana, wiser still, hid in the treetops by day, only visiting her parents in the darkest hours of the night. After weeks of the best hunters in the land failing to capture Tuthiana, the cunning villagers became more sly. They secretly followed their children and discovered where Tuthiana's parents were hiding. They left a trail of coins for the hunters to follow. But only one hunter came, the one they almost feared. It was then that the mysterious hunter finally spoke. His voice was strange, high-pitched, almost comical, but his words were cold as death. Seize the parents, he snarled. Make it known that I will slit their throats if Tuthiana does not surrender. That will bring this child to flight out of hiding. His plan made sense. The villagers did as he suggested. They attacked Harum and Rashmi's camp. With so many against them, the two surrendered without a fight. They had told their clever daughter to never try and help them if they were ever captured. But the mysterious hunter had planned for that. He shouted out to any creature that could hear, "The parents of the flying girl will die by dawn if she comes not." Creatures of the jungle hurried to warn Tuthiana that her parents were doomed if she did not come. Tuthiana had never disobeyed her parents, but the thought of them at the dubious mercy of these grown-ups filled her with rage and determination, and she flew straight to her parents' aid. She dove down from the treetops, ready to kill any who would try to harm her parents. But Harum and Rashmi were brave and cunning as well. Harum, who had never harmed a living creature, was prepared to stop at nothing to prevent his daughter from being enslaved. And Rashmi, like all sisters of flight, had been a great warrior. As Tuthiana neared, they slashed and fought like beings possessed. Tuthiana flickered back and forth, hovering over her mother and father, reaching for them, but she did not have the strength to lift them up over the angry mob. Rashmi thrust a stringed pouch into her daughter's hands. "Keep these to remember us by. Keep these to protect yourself," she pleaded to her daughter. "Now go," her father commanded. "Go." With a heart-rending cry, the winged girl did as her father ordered. She flew away, but stopped, unsure of what to do. Her ears were filled with the sound of the vengeful mob falling upon her parents. "Go," shouted her mother. Tuthiana flew wildly and desperately away, and as she went, she screamed from the depths of her soul. It was the scream of two beings, human and animal. It was a scream so pained and fierce that it caused all the village who were attacking her parents to go briefly deaf, all except the mysterious hunter. He screamed back to Tuthiana. His was a scream equally unsettling, a scream of rage and hate that was more animal than human. Tuthiana knew in that instant that she had a mortal enemy, one who she must kill or be killed by. But for now, she would grieve. She flew to the highest treetop and huddled deep inside its foliage. She had no tears, only the blank ache of a now empty life. She rocked back and forth in a trance of disbelief for a full day and night. Then she remembered the pouch her mother had thrust into her hands. Trembling, she opened it. Inside was a small box carved from a single giant ruby. It was covered in feathery patterns, and Tuthiana knew that the box had once been the ruby-tipped arrow that had nearly killed her parents. Inside this beautiful box was a cluster of baby teeth and a note. "Our dearest girl, these are the teeth of your childhood. If you have them under your pillow as you sleep or hold them tightly, you will remember that which you need, a memory of happy days or of deepest hopes, or even of us in better times. But one tooth is not yours. It is a tooth of amazing power, and from what being it comes from, we do not know." Use it only in times of the greatest danger or need, your dearest parents. So, one tooth. It is a tooth of amazing power, and from what being it comes from, we do not know. Use it only in times of the greatest danger or need, your dearest parents. Tuthiana still did not cry, not even after reading the note. She slept with her baby teeth under her pillow and took solace in the dreams and memories it gave her. Chapter 13, Lost Teeth and a Purpose Found. Tuthiana stayed in the jungle. She began to hate her wings. Once she had thought them wondrous things, but now she saw them as the reason for the death of her parents. Her grief and loneliness knew no depths. The creatures of the jungle did what they could to help her by bringing her food and making her treetop sleeping places as comfortable as possible. The children of the village tried to aid as well, but they now had to be doubly cautious of the village grown-ups. As for Tuthiana, she became more and more convinced that she belonged nowhere, not among the creatures of the jungle, and certainly not among the humans of the village. She was alone. When she was at her very saddest, she would take one of her baby teeth from the card box she always carried in her mother's pouch she now wore around her neck and hold it until it revealed its memories. As the lonely years passed, Tuthiana saw that the village children lost much of their innocence and some of their goodness as they grew up. She began to collect their teeth so that in the future she could give them back their childhood memories and remind them of their kindness, just as her own parents had done for her. Soon the children, not wanting their parents to find out, began to hide their lost teeth under their pillows for Tuthiana to find, and she, cheered by this new game of sorts, began in turn to leave behind small bits of treasure she had found in the jungle. A gold nugget here, a sprinkling of sapphire chips there. But you can imagine the curiosity that is stirred when a 5-year-old sits down to breakfast with an uncut ruby in her palm, or when a 10-year-old boy comes to the table with a pocket full of emeralds. Once again, the hearts of the grown-ups filled with greed, and it wasn't long before they forced their children to tell them how they had come upon those treasures, and soon enough they had laid a new trap for Tuthiana. One dark, cloudy night, Tuthiana flew to the village to make her nightly rounds. A boy named Akela had lost his 2 front teeth, and Tuthiana had a special treasure saved for him, 2 beautiful uncut diamonds. But as she entered his open window, it wasn't Akela she found. Instead, the mysterious hunter leaped toward her. From behind his shroud of rags, she could see the strangest eyes, close together, beady, not entirely human, and cold with hate. Tuthiana's rage clouded her keen intellect. All she could think of was, I must get rid of this thing. But before she could act, the steel door slammed down between her and the hunter. She glanced around with bird-like quickness. The room was not Akela's bedroom, but in fact, a cleverly disguised steel cage. She was trapped. The villagers cheered as the hunter hauled away the cage. His platoon of slave-like helpers pulled the wheeled prison away from the villagers and into the jungle. The helpers were as strangely shrouded as the hunter who commanded them was, and seemed excited by the capture. The children wept, begging their parents to let Tuthiana go free, but they would not. The mysterious hunter had promised them riches beyond their dreams when she sold Tuthiana. Tuthiana flung herself wildly against the cage like a cornered eagle, but it did no good. The hunter and his minions traveled swiftly through the night deeper into the jungle. They knew the creatures of the wild would try to help Tuthiana, so they carried the one weapon every animal fears, fire. Torches were lashed to the roof of Tuthiana's cage. The mysterious hunter himself carried the brightest torch of all. The animals kept their distance, but they continued to follow the eerie caravan and keep watch over Tuthiana, waiting for a chance to strike. After days of travel, they arrived at the base of the steep mountain of Tuthiana's birthplace, the kingdom of Punjab High Low. The great elephants that guarded the mountain were standing at the ready, shifting back and forth on their massive feet. Tuthiana's jungle friends had warned them that the mysterious hunter was headed their way. The hunter did not challenge the elephants. He ordered his minions to halt and make no move to attack. Instead, he held his flaming torch aloft. I bring a treasure to the sisters of flight and the flying elephant king who dwell in Punjab High Low, he shouted in the night sky. The sky was empty. There was no sign of either the winged women who ruled there or the flying elephant. The hunter called out again. I bring you the half-breed daughter of Harum and Rashmi. At this, an otherworldly sound like a rustle of trees in the wind was heard. And indeed, wind did begin to blow down from the mountain. It grew stronger and more furious with gusts. It nearly put out the torches. Tuthiana knew instinctively that this wind was sent by the Sisters of Flight and that they did not trust the hunter. She also knew that it was time to take out the box her parents had left her. As the winds continued to rise, the hunter grew increasingly nervous, as did his minions. They began to chatter in the oddest way, not in words, but in sounds. Then a chorus of voices, all speaking in unison, rang out bright and clear above the howl of the wind. Tell us, hunter, why cage our child? Where be her father and mother? What trick of men did you bring us? What do you seek, you who seem of men and yet are not? The hunter rocked on his feet, seizing with undisguised hate. He held his torch high and stepped forward, leaning into the wind. The elephants raised their trunks but took a step back. Fire was a fearsome thing even for these mighty beasts. The hunter laughed, then threw down his tattered cloak. He was no man at all, but a massive monkey. A Maharaja of men I once was, he screamed, and by your doing I am now a king of the monkeys. Then his troops dropped their cloaks as well. An array of monkeys revealed themselves, all armored with bows and arrows. The Monkey King shrieked above the roaring wind. You ask about her parents? Dead by my doing. What do I seek? Revenge on all who made me thus. Then he threw his torch into the herd of elephants and grabbed a bow and arrow from one of his men. He had drawn it in an instant and aimed it directly at Tuthiana's heart. Before he could let loose the arrow, the wind tripled in strength. Tuthiana knew what to do. She held the ruby box tightly in her hand. Mother, father, help me, she whispered furiously, clenching her eyes shut. She pictured them clearly in her mind, letting herself feel the bond they had shared so deeply, letting herself remember how much they had sacrificed for her. And suddenly, she was no longer in the cage. She was no longer a single entity, but several smaller versions of herself. Bow drawn, the Monkey King hesitated, bewildered. How can this be? He could not remember the power of love, even though it had been this girl's father who had loved him best. And his own memories were now fueled only by hate. So the world turned against him once again. The Sisters of Flight circled overhead. It was the flapping of their wings that made the great wind. It grew wilder and stranger like a tornado. Leaves snapped off trees, dirt swirled like a storm, and the Monkey King's torch blew out. Now the only light came from the moon, and no jungle creature fears that guiding light. In an instant, the elephants stampeded forward. Tuthiana's animal friends attacked. Tuthiana's mini selves charged the Monkey King. The monkey army screamed and ran. The king tried to grab the Tuthianas, but he could not catch them. Then all the fairy-sized selves merged back into a single being. Tuthiana was mystified by her new power, but she didn't think on it with one hand. She grabbed the Monkey King by the throat. It was as if she now had the strength of a dozen. The Monkey King cried out in terror and pain. For an instant, Tuthiana felt the rage within her swell. She would snap his neck and be done with him. But the little box glowed in one hand, and the memory of her parents made her stop. She would not end this monkey man's life. Let the jungle choose his fate. So she let him go. He fell to the ground, and she did not look back as she flew up to join the Sisters of Flight. As they sped away, Tuthiana and her kindred could hear the creatures of the jungle do as they saw fit with the fallen monkey king, and his cries could be heard all the way to the moon. Mr. QWERTY then shut his pages. The tale, as it was written, was done. Tuthiana's story made Catherine feel many things, but the strangest was a twinge of envy. Tuthiana had memories of her parents. It was something Catherine wished for more than anything. Chapter 14. Nightlight faces the unknown. After listening at the window to the story of Queen Tuthiana, Nightlight flew listlessly around the mountains that surrounded the lunar lapidary. He was increasingly troubled. Until now, he had viewed the events of his life in very simple terms. To him, the world was divided into good and bad. Catherine and the Guardians were good, absolutely, and Pitch was bad, through and through, without even an ounce of good in him, and yet Nightlight was confounded by what he had seen in Catherine's dream tear. And in this dream, Pitch's hand was human, as it had been since he tried to make Nightlight the darkling prince. But there was more. In the dream, Pitch had held in his human hand a locket with his daughter's picture, but the picture shifted and Catherine's face took its place. And then her face began to change. It became different, older, a grown-up's face, and then darker, more like Pitch's. Nightlight was afraid of this dream. It felt true. No Guardian had seen any sign of Pitch of late, yet Nightlight had. Pitch lived in Catherine's dreams. What did this mean? Would you grow up? Would you become like so many adults, a grim shadow of her youthful self? Or was there a greater danger? Would she somehow be taken over by Pitch? Was her soul in danger? These questions tore at his heart and his soul in ways he could not comprehend or put into words, so he turned to his oldest friend. For hours he waited for the moon to rise, and when it did, he took Catherine's dream tear and held it up. The moonbeam inside his staff began to flash, and moments later, the man in the moon responded to his signal. Moonbeams shined down and flickered as they interpreted the dream tear. The Nightlight, waiting anxiously, finally whispered in his rarely used and otherworldly voice, "Will my Catherine go darkling or stay true?" He stood still and tense for a long time, until a moonbeam brought back the simple answer. The answer, it was the truth of everything. Believe, 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 it said. His answer was, believe, believe, believe. And for the first time in his endless childhood life, Nightlight cried. He was not sure why he was crying. He could not describe the feeling that brought the tears. It was not happiness or sorrow. It was not good or bad, but it was something just as powerful. Someday he would know what it was, that first mysterious step beyond childhood. It is a strange feeling to realize that you will grow up, especially for one who has been a child for so long. But he now had the answer he needed to face this uncertainty. Believe, believe, believe. If he could remember that, he would make everything right. And so his tears stopped. He wiped them from his cheeks, then brought them close to his face. So unaccustomed was he to having tears. Each was bright with light and seemed to take the burden from his anxious heart. He let them spill together with Catherine's dream tear. Then he took the diamond tip of his staff and touched it to the tears, holding it there until they fused with the diamond. Now the spear-like point of his staff held not just his friend's tear, fear, and sorrow, but his own as well. The moonbeam inside grew furiously bright, for sorrow and fear that are triumphed over make a powerful weapon. Sorrow and fear that are triumphed over make a powerful weapon. In that instant, he heard Catherine calling for him, and he knew that whatever might come, he was ready. Chapter 50. It is not easy to fall asleep when an entire village, an army of abominable snowmen, a troop of ancient lunar holy men, and all your best friends are coming into your bedroom and wishing you good night. It is also not easy to sleep when you know you are going to be visited by a half bird, half human queen with magical powers, and it is really hard to sleep when you have made a secret plan with your dearest friend to do the one thing you've been told you absolutely must not do when this particular queen arrives. So there Catherine sat in her huge and feathered bed in her special room in the lunar lamidary, as wide as wake lamidary, as wide awake as any 12-year-old has ever been. She'd just checked under her pillow for the 11th time to make sure that her tooth hadn't somehow rolled onto the floor when Norther opened the bedroom door again, just enough to stick in his head. Still awake? He asked in surprise. Ombrick and Bunnyman crowded in next to him, crammed so tightly in the doorway that Catherine could see only half of Ombrick's face and one of Bunnyman's ears, with Ombrick's beard tangled around it. Perhaps if you chant the ancient Atlantean phrase, sleepo, deepo, slumberly do, Ombrick began to suggest. Bunnyman interrupted with counting. That'll do it. Count chocolate eggs, jumping counterclockwise over a small wall, also made out of chocolate. And North interrupted, saying, song, we should sing a song. Then they all began to talk at once. It should be about eggs. A sleepy chocolate egg opera would be perfect. No, no, no. A good old-fashioned Cossack lullaby. Don't cut my throat while I'm sleeping, mother, my mother dear. North, that's awful. No, she should chant, dream, dream, dream of chocolate ocean waves. And so it went till Nightlight blew down from the rafters, and with a firm but caring swing of his staff, slammed the door shut. The three guardians muttered outside the door for a moment or two. Then the lunar llamas could be heard suggesting that the centuries-old method of simply being left alone, quietly alone, tended to bring about sleep quite reliably. And so things finally settled down. Nightlight leaped to Catherine's bed and sat cross-legged on the footboard. He still seemed different to her, no longer quite so sad or distant, but the cheerful half grin that had always been there was replaced by a look that seemed, well, she couldn't really put a finger on it, but he didn't seem quite so like a little boy now. And whether it was the llama's suggestion or just the result of a very full day, Catherine suddenly felt overcome with sleepiness and ready to close her eyes. But she propped herself up on one elbow for another minute, careful not to shift the pillow that covered her tooth. She wanted to go over the plan she'd concocted earlier with Nightlight one more time. It had come to her when the lunar llamas had told her even more details about the workings of Queen Tuthiana. It had taken a while, given the llama's propensity for vague answers, but Catherine had learned that she had to be asleep for Tuthiana to come and take her tooth. And only Tuthiana could unlock the countless memories in a tooth by holding it in her magic grasp. Once the memories were unlocked, Catherine wanted her tooth back. You must get my tooth back the instant she does her magic, she reminded Nightlight. Nightlight nodded. He could feel how much this meant to Catherine. She wants to remember her mother and father, he thought Nightlight. And if she remembers them, then perhaps she'll forget pitch. That's what he believed in his hopeful heart. He had never failed Catherine before, and he would not fail her now. Chapter 16, in which we see the extremely secret process by which a tooth is gathered. For century upon century, Queen Tuthiana flew majestically on her nightly rounds with her half-dozen mini-selves. At the bedside of every child who had left a tooth under his pillow or her pillow, one of her selves quietly collected the tooth and made a silent wish. The children each were different, but the wish was the same, that the child would grow up to be kind and happy. Kind and happy. In the many villages and cities and jungles of Asia, the children knew to place their lost tooth under their pillows. Then a tiny treasure would be left in place of the tooth, and the tooth would be stored in the palace of the flying elephant of Punjab High Low until it was needed again. Once, Tuthiana had loved to spend time at each child's bedside, straightening a blanket that had been kicked off or whispering messages of hope into sleeping ears. She had loved to peek from the windows as the children woke in the morning, their joyful cries when they reached under their pillows and found their gifts. This was her treasure. But she wanted to help all the children in the world. However, there simply wasn't enough of her to go around. Since she'd learned long ago that jewels of any kind were likely to bring the wrong kind of interest from adults, she had begun to use coins or other smaller treasures in exchange for teeth. But oh, the coins. Children loved to receive them. However, as more countries were formed, more currencies were invented, and each child required the coin from his or her realm. It became a complicated business. Even with 6 of her, there was barely time to outrun the coming dawn. Yet, despite Queen Tuthiana's hurried pace, there was something about her presence that calmed every child she visited, and while on any given night she might encounter a bad dream or two, the terrible time of the nightmare man seemed to be over. The children in her lands, like children everywhere, called him the boogeyman, and she'd seen no sign of him for months. While Queen Tuthiana knew less about the guardians than they knew about her, she'd observed that glimmering boy made of light who had been involved in battling the boogeyman. She'd seen how brave he'd been saving a girl who wrote stories and drew pictures. She felt a special fondness for the two of them. In a strange way, their devotion to each other reminded her of her parents' devotion, and so she was looking very much forward to the last stop of the evening. For the very first time, she'd received a call to the highest peak in the Himalayas, to the lunar Lamadery. There she knew she would find out more about this valiant girl who rode on a giant goose. Meanwhile, Nightlight waited for Queen Tuthiana on the top of the Lamadery's tower with as much patience as he could muster. He remembered the first time he'd seen the bird woman. He'd been playing moonbeam tag when she'd flickered by so quickly that he mistook her for an enormous hummingbird, and from time to time they glimpsed each other. She'd never spoken to him, but she always nodded whenever their flying paths briefly crossed. But Nightlight, with his keen intuition, sensed that she distrusted most people and didn't want the other guardians to know about her, so he had kept his knowledge of her to himself. Besides, there was something about her that made him feel sort of shy. But Catherine asked for his help, so he kept his eyes trained on the night sky, peering among the bright stars for the first sign of this Tuthiana. Soon, Nightlight spied a glow. It was a shimmer, flickering sparks of iridescent blues and greens. As it came closer, Nightlight made out a feathered head, bright green eyes, and a happy smile. He tried to hide, but Tuthiana and her mini-selves saw him before he could leap into the shadows. Tuthiana knew immediately that he was up to something. Through the centuries, too many children had plotted and planned to wake up at the moment she arrived for her to be caught unawares now. She shook her head sternly and held a finger to her lips, warning him not to interfere. Nightlight wavered. His deepest loyalty rested with Catherine, and yet he found himself acutely aware that he needed to trust this winged being, at least for the moment. With the slightest of nods, he let her know that he would do as she asked, but he followed her closely as she and her selves shot through the window and down to Catherine's bed. 3 of the many selves, no bigger than sparrows, each carried a gold coin. They flew silently to Catherine's pillow, then tucked in their wings and crawled gently and silently under it. Another landed by Catherine's ear and plucked at a tiny silver instrument. There they are. Plucked at a tiny silver instrument while she sang a soft, lulling song. Nightlight was fascinated. They sing to make her sleep more soundly, he realized. Another mini self stood guard by the pillow, while the last one winged about the room and seemed to be keeping watch as Toothiana, an expectant smile upon her face, waited for the tooth to be smuggled from under the pillow. The pillow puckered here and rumpled there. Then at last, the 3 small fairies emerged, Catherine's tooth in hand. Toothiana picked it up tenderly. With her other hand, she brought out a beautiful carved ruby box from a pouch she wore around her neck and held it tightly. She closed her eyes as if in deep thought. A glow began to emanate from both Catherine's tooth and the box. The Queen's magical power seemed to be working. Nightlight had seen all he needed. As willful as the flying woman seemed, he would do as Catherine asked. He readied himself to swoop in to take the tooth, but a quiet, mournful sigh from Toothiana made him pause, puzzled. A sadness came over her lovely face, and then her many selves sighed as well, as though they shared her every feeling. She could see all of Catherine's memories. Toothiana murmured, "Poor child, you're like me. You've lost your mother and father, but you didn't even have a chance to know or remember them." She bowed her head ever so slightly and looked down at Catherine, who slept on. "I must give you the memory you long for," she whispered. Nightlight leaned forward anxiously as Toothiana lowered the hand that held the tooth to Catherine's forehead. Nightlight knew he needn't steal the tooth now. Catherine would have the memory. He was glad. He felt a peculiar bond with this bird royal and didn't want to anger her. But suddenly, a sound, most angry, stopped Toothiana from granting her wish. A sound, most angry, stopped Toothiana from granting Catherine her wish.